The life and influence of Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol was a brilliant artist from a very young age, and he would go on to be an influence in the art world in countless different ways later in life. He would dream of fame and notoriety while being afflicted with incredible shyness. He wanted to be an observer to life rather than a participant, and it shows in his art, with his unique view on life as it moves around him. Andy's eye for the immediate events around him would serve to help gain the fame he so desired all throughout his life. Andy Warhol was a figure that aspired to be great and would eventually be on the precipice of the pop art movement and would shape the culture we live in today. Andrew Warhol, born Andrew Warhola on the 6th of August, 1928 in the town of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His parents migrated from a country by the name of Ruthenia in hopes of achieving a better life for themselves and their children. Andrew was the youngest of 4 children to Andrew Sr. and Julia Warhola. Andrew Sr. worked in a coal mine, while Julia did anything she could to help bring in money. Anything included cleaning houses for $1 a day and going door to door to sell floral bouquets made of tin cans and paper, which she sold for $0.25 apiece. Every day from a very young age, Andy's mother would bring him along with her on a 3-mile journey to the small Byzantine church, where services were conducted in Old Slavonic and where they began with an exorcism of the devil. 8 hours per week, Andy would take in the iconography of his church, which had portraits of saints and religious symbols situated in grid patterns with gold leaf background. This would go on to heavily influence his future work. The simplicity and sense of color would come from these iconic images. From the very start, it was clear to Andy's parents that he was different from other children. He had a pale complexion and a general lack of interest in normal boyhood rough and tumble playing. There was an absence of girlfriends, and he was afflicted with crippling shyness. He was so shy that he could not enter rooms in his home where his family had gathered. So instead, he would stick his hand around the corner of the wall, all the while holding his newest completed drawings to show them off. This shyness would only be exacerbated by a disease he contracted in the 3rd grade by the name of Sydenham's chorea. This is a nervous system disease that causes involuntary movements of the extremities. It is believed to be a complication of scarlet fever. Sydenham's chorea also causes skin pigmentation blotchiness. School was challenging for Andy from the very start, but after contracting Sydenham's chorea, it had now become a nightmare for him. Even the most basic of actions were impeded by his disease, and he would be ruthlessly ridiculed by the other children. He was eventually pulled from school entirely and was confined to bed for months. During this time, he became an absolute master of his inner world, and was capable of incredible feats of focus and intense concentration while poring over his artwork and collection of favorite images. During this time, he developed an obsession with Shirley Temple, and he wrote to her fan club where he received a glossy new photo of Shirley signed by the child actress. He venerated this photo with the same zealous passion his mother exhibited for the icons of her church. The same day the atomic bomb was dropped, Andy enrolled in Carnegie Mellon University, or Carnegie Tech. During his time at Carnegie Tech, Andy learned the blotted line technique, which would go on to define his artistic style for quite some time. The blotted line technique consists of making a drawing on one paper and then blotting it onto another piece of paper. It gives off the illusion of the image being printed and would allow for many images to be made from a single image. This would prove heavily influential, and he would go on to experiment with this technique all throughout his career. As graduation neared, all Andy could think about is leaving Pittsburgh and going on to New York City. His mother desperately tried to dissuade him by saying, "You will end up dead in the gutter without a penny in your pocket." Her attempts at admonition proved unsuccessful. 2 weeks later, he walked the streets of New York with $200 in his pocket and an art portfolio under his arm. For the next 4 decades, this would be the only place he would ever feel at home. His very first job was working as a commercial illustrator for Glamour magazine, drawing stylized shoes. Due to a typesetter leaving out the A at the end of his name, he would be referred to as Andy Warhol for the rest of his life. During this time, he gained the title Raggedy Andy for his battered coat, his oversized glasses, and caved-in shoes, as well as the brown paper bags he would always bring his work in instead of art portfolios. Also during this time, he developed an obsession in the writer Truman Capote after seeing a photograph of him in the dust jacket of one of his books. He idolized Mr. Capote He wanted to be him, all the way to the point of trying to be mistaken for Mr. Capote in public. Andy would sit outside Capote's gate and draw pictures to leave on his doorstep. Truman Capote utterly ignored him, believing that he was simply another born loser. Andy turned this rejection around into his first art exhibit on June 16, 1952, under the title 15 Drawings Based on the Writings of Truman Capote. None of his pieces sold. Soon after his first art exhibit, his mother showed up on his doorstep, saying that she had sold the family farm and had come to live with her youngest son until he had created a family of his own. In the end, Andy and his mother would live together for the next 20 years until just before her death in 1972. Although Andy would try and screen her from public view, he cherished her housekeeping skills and her artistic sense. With her there to handle the day-to-day life problems, he was able to work more hours and take on more assignments. By 1959, he was the most well-known and well-paid commercial artist in New York. This would prove to be a large obstacle while he tried to move in to higher art. The first change to the modern art movement came from an artist by the name of Jasper Johns, with a gallery show exhibiting hand-painted paintings of everyday objects. This was an instant sensation, and the exhibit sold out immediately. By 1961, Andy was creating paintings of what we would now consider pop art. With this new work, Warhol would surpass the earlier pop art predecessors. By 1962, Warhol expunges all brushstrokes from his paintings, and they become increasingly flat. Colors were being applied with no medium tones, so each color is vibrant against the one right next to it. Despite these radical changes, still no one would exhibit his work. People in the art world believed he was anathema to art, and all his work killed what art was supposed to be. By the end of 1961, he was the only one of the pop art movement that did not have his art exhibited. During this difficult time, Andy turned to his friends for advice. One trusted friend replied, "You like money. You should make pictures of money. You should paint pictures of something people see every day, like a can of soup." The very next day, Andy gathered all 32 kinds of soup Campbell's made. He began to experiment with a variety of approaches, eventually focusing on the simplest strategy possible: 32 single-can paintings, each showing a different variety of soup painted in the style he had been perfecting over the last year. This proved to be the turning point in Andy Warhol's career. From this point on in his art, Warhol became infatuated with a technique called silk screening. This is where you get a silk screen with a picture on it, and run paint through it onto a surface, and voila, a recreation of the image is displayed. With this technique, each picture comes out slightly different, or off, each time. Andy loved the idea of these little imperfections. His beginning silk screenings were that of Coca-Cola bottles and dollar bills, but he soon learned he could do the same thing with photographs and moved on to doing pictures of celebrities. Around this time, Andy began doing series of silk screens displaying presidents, heroes, and movie stars. Then on August 4th, 1962, the same day the gallery exhibiting his soup can collection closed, Marilyn Monroe committed suicide. Marilyn would become the next subject in Andy's paintings. For these paintings, he reversed the normal method in which paintings were usually created. In traditional method, first you draw an outline, and then color it in. Well, Andy reversed the process. Andy would begin with color first, and then proceed to outline on top of it. In the end, Andy created 23 different Marilyn paintings. The silk screen he used for these paintings was so clogged with ink that many of them were marred with imperfections. This brought upon a change to her face that made it look like she was making a different expression in every painting, and Andy loved it this way. Not long after, on November 6, 1962, Andy's first one-man show opened and took the world by storm. He showed 18 of his best paintings, and this exhibit established him as an equal among the pop art movement, and as one of the most important figures in contemporary American art. Around this time, Andy began being interested in filmmaking, which inspired him to move on to a larger workspace. This studio would eventually become known as the Factory. This environment provided an area where he was able to work and film, and where he received people. Famous people from all around would come visit the Factory, be in and take part in his films, to do drugs, and to have free sex. Think of your stereotypical hippies with the mindset of free love and openness. This is where that mindset began. The night that the doors to the factory were thrown open, the world came in, and many people who attended this phenomenal event claimed that was the night the 60s began. Over the next 5 years, Andy would focus on filmmaking. He would go on to make many brilliant pieces, such as Lips, a film in which it appears you are seeing a single slide of a couple kissing until one of the actors blinks. In the film Sleep, a film starring Warhol's friend and sometimes lover, John Giorno, is shown sleeping for 5 hours and 20 minutes. Andy would go on to create living portrait films, where anyone who came to visit the factory could sit in front of a camera for 3 minutes and do whatever they wished. Andy would simply turn on the camera and leave until filming was done. Warhol's work in filmmaking culminated into a multimedia event called Exploding Plastic Inevitable, in which a band named the Velvet Underground played music at an incredibly high volume, while a man in the background, covered in leather straps, lifted a dumbbell and cracked a whip, all the while pretending to shoot up heroin with a ballpoint pen. At the same time, a woman walked among the crowd of over 1,000, injecting people with real amphetamines through their clothing. Andy stood above everyone, directing and controlling a series of silent films being projected onto the band and the wall behind them. All the while, a series of strobe lights and filters created a show of incredible light and sound. Andy was at the pinnacle of the pop art movement during this time, and anything produced in the factory sent shockwaves throughout the pop art world. However, by 1968, the factory had fallen from what it once was, and Andy moved into a new workspace in which he was almost assassinated by a woman named Valerie Solanas. For several years after this, Andy was adrift, without direction. As he moved into the 1970s, he picked himself up and began back where he started, as a commercial artist. However, this time, Andy was working and thinking as a businessman, selling his now very valuable pop art works and working for commissions. He would go on to do this until his death due to medical negligence after going in for a gallbladder issue in 1987 on February 22nd at the age of 58. Andy was a man who aspired to be great. He reached his goal of standing at the precipice of the art movement, all the while subtly changing the culture around him. Andy was, for all his shyness and passivity, a great and influential man, and his works are still highly regarded to this day. The world would be a very different place if Andy Warhol had not died when and how he did. If Pablo Picasso was the most influential artist of the first half of the 20th century, then I would say that Andy Warhol was the most influential artist for the second half.